Alright guys, you're going to hate me, but I want you to stop this video and I would like you to do questions on 146 and 147 in order to recap on what Hume's skepticism was all about, and also maybe to rethink about the idea of the problem of induction. Okay? Once you've done that, we'll get right into the first extract. Okay? Alright, here we go. The first extract is based on this concept that we cannot be certain of the self. Now, if you've already thought, oh, certainty is related to this problem of induction, you are on the right track. You are definitely on the right track. And let's see how sensory experience allows us to move towards such a conclusion. Okay, now let's have a look. Alrighty. First thing to say is that if we look at Descartes' account of the person, which is the thinking thing, and Locke's account of the thinking thing, he rejects it. He basically says there is no such, sorry, did I say the thinking thing? I should say the conscious thing. He believes that there is no such thing as a unified self. The self does not exist as a unified entity, all right? And he's saying if the self does exist, then here's how it should exist. It should be a singular, changeless impression of yourself, but maintained throughout a long period of time. Now, he's saying that's pretty well impossible. How can you have this singular, changeless impression of yourself deep down in your unconscious mind? He doesn't believe that you can locate it. Take a note. Alright, however, right, let's not forget that he says that knowledge, that's why I've got all these itty-bitty pictures inside the brain, gleaned from the senses, right, tells us that we encounter changes, alright? Now, because every time we gain this knowledge and every time we accrue this knowledge, we start noticing that, well, everything does change. Everything is always different. And a fixed, immutable impression, because it's gleaned from sensory experience, is impossible, okay? It just can't be done. So it calls into question this idea of the unified self. So let's go through this logic again. If the self exists, it must exist as a singular, changeless impression. And remember, an impression is like an immediate memory of sensory experience. However, knowledge gleaned from the senses is always subject to change in the now, okay? So having this fixed, immutable impression is impossible because an impression is knowledge gleaned from the senses. Therefore, bang, you can't really exist as a self. It's uncertain. Take a note. And so from that non-certain self, he looks at what we call a bundle theory of self. Now, a bundle theory of self is, okay, look, if there isn't a unified self tying together all of our perceptions, then how is it that we do tie together all of these perceptions? That's what he's arguing. And that's why I've got these bundles of circles here, because really, I mean, how do we form this bundle, which he actually acknowledges does exist, right? And he goes on and he says, well, we do that through ideas. We do that by creating associations between impressions which are based on our perceptions, okay? And we constantly do it, and it's constantly in flux, and it's always changing, And that's because our perceptions are always changing, which means the bundle is always changing. So the self isn't fixed. It's this rapidly changing, fluctuating, always evolving, unique bundle and random tying together of impressions and ideas and links between other ideas and other ideas. That's what the self is. That's what the self is. Yeah, it's a bundle theory of self. There is no unified center of where this happens or unified thing making this happen. There are just links between impressions and ideas that are constantly changing and constantly in flux. Okay, that's what this picture represents. It represents the idea of perpetual motion, which means constant flux, constant change. Okay, take a note. So he then argues that the self must actually be this bundle of perceptions. And I've drawn this because you should be able to understand how perceptions change. I mean, when I immediately see this picture, I think of a lady turning her head, but other people will see the old lady with a wart on her nose. Again, my senses are giving me fluctuating impressions that are constantly changing. And so this bundle of self must be something that is always changing, dynamic. It's not a fixed, centered thing like Locke and Descartes have us to believe. Hey guys, can I recommend that you do take visual representations of these concepts, because they will get a bit tough in a minute, and it's really important that you actually have a concrete understanding of what this stuff is, or a metaphorical understanding, just to give yourself a way in for remembering it when it comes to exams or SACs. So if the self is this bundle of networked ideas and impressions, right, then why do we posit this identity? Right? We know that it changes. He's just argued that it changes. Why do we say that there is a singular self? Why does that happen in language? All right? And he says that's because we do observe objects. We have impressions of objects, and remember, impressions are memories of immediate sensory experience, right? That concludes that some things just have fixed identities according to our experience. A rock, if we were to put it in front of us for like an hour, would stay completely the same, and that kind of experience gets generalized onto other things. Okay, so in this case, we can say for a given period of time, the identity of the rock is fixed. Rocks don't change, but the self, or the illusion of the self, is completely different. It's a different entity. It's not like the rock, right? So we assume sameness amongst ourselves. We really do. However, that sameness is a bit of an illusion, and the reason why he says we generate that illusion is because as we form this bundle of ideas, this connection of many ideas, we attribute the fixed permanent nature to many different things, and this is an illusion created by the mind. All right. Now I'll give you an example. Right here, I said different but related objects that succeed each other. These are not the same strawberry evolving into the big juicy red strawberry. What they are many different strawberries that have been picked from different places. But your mind would have automatically created a relationship between them over time and attributed a sameness because you've observed other instances where there are fixed identities, all right? So you would have thought, oh, it's the same strawberry, and it's turning into a ripe strawberry, right? You don't make the assumption that they're all different. But according to Hume, that's an error in thinking. Like, how can we actually attribute the sameness to all of these different strawberries? Now, let's just say that my example is a little different. Let's say in this example, they're not different strawberries that have come together to create the illusion of an evolving strawberry. Let's say they are the same strawberry taken over time. Now, he would say quite easily that, well, you have different sensory experiences of observing each of these strawberries. So what is happening in effect is you're observing different, distinct things. And your mind creates the illusion of cause and effect and continuity, which in turn is an illusion. And the same thing happens with the self. As these bundles changes, you kind of attribute the sameness to this idea of self, which isn't really there. And that's because you want to create a smooth, that's because you just don't, you want to be able to reconcile your observation of things like this rock with your observations of things that do change. You want to be able to say, well, I understand what they have that's similar, and that's that they have some kind of fixedness. But even he would argue, well, he argues that the strawberry that changes over the time creates different strawberries, different instances. And there's an illusion of sameness that's created by the human mind because I want to reconcile that with that. All right, take a note. So that's pretty complex, right? This sameness that the mind ascribes to things that it's even hard to get away from it in terms of language, right? The continuity that would exist in a ripening strawberry. Most of us just can't get away from the logic that it's the same entity evolving in one direction, when really he would say, nope, what you're doing is you're falsely tying together a bunch of different sensory impressions and you're unifying it behind this false concept of the strawberry, yeah? So we posit, we create this continuity, right, because we want to remove interruptions in terms of our thinking. We don't want to have a kind of muddled up, nonsensical kind of understanding of the world. We want to understand it in one train of thought, in one way. It's the way that the mind is psychologically engineered to see things, okay? And this means that the way that we perceive the illusion of sameness is not just a linguistic thing, but it's also about imagination. All right? We have a problem of linguistics. The language we use to describe the strawberry as it evolves has an illusion, but also the fact that we imagine and create the causal links when we've only observed it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, and it could be a different rearrangement of molecules continuously changing over like 5 weeks. The fact that we attribute sameness to it is also an issue of imagination. We're imagining the causal links. We're imagining the resemblance too, yeah? So this is a problem. Like, we posit identity over things that, over different sensations or different impressions that exist in succession to each other. And these impressions that are different also show us change, and we attribute the idea of change, and we think that they're all related. So when we look at events or objects that are different, occur in succession, that communicate to us something about change and have a relationship with each other, just like this strawberry, right? We tend to attribute sameness. We just do it psychologically, okay? And this is an error. This is an error in thinking. So let me just explain that in terms of the strawberry again. Each strawberry is different. We can see, or we can logically put together a succession as the strawberry evolves over time, or grows over time. We can see change, and we can see that there's a relationship. We are putting together a we are putting together a relationship between all these different strawberries, and we're creating that kind of sameness, right? And we tend to ascribe sameness to things that meet those 4 criteria of difference occurring in succession, changing each time we go through the step of this succession, and they're related to each other. Again, the tree's a perfect example. Starts off as a seed, grows into some little shrub, turns into a little tree, then grows into a huge tree. We attribute sameness to all these 3 things, even though they're different, and even though our sensory experiences are completely distinct. Take a note. So, Hume comes along and basically says, look, I, for all philosophical accounts and purposes, solely believe that if a thing is completely separate, then that thing must be its own particular entity. And I believe that that is the case with impressions, which are direct memories of sensory experience, okay? So once something is being modified, it becomes new. And if we look at all these bananas, as soon as it changes just one tiny bit, it is a new thing. The sameness is an illusion, right? Okay? To modify an entity means to create a new entity. But he also acknowledges there might be a goal. So in the case of plants, right, there might be a goal which is to preserve life, or to preserve a living thing, that links the new arrangements of all the molecules and all the cells and all the organelles, all the structures that the cells create, all the organs that the cells create. There might be a goal that unifies them and gives them a purpose, but they still, for an empirical point of view, from an observation point of view, have different arrangements. So at each stage of this seedling's growth, it is a different entity, right? It only has a relation of parts, which means that the parts, the only relation is the relation of parts, which is basically the arrangement of every particular molecule in it, which changes over time. He readily concedes there's a goal holding things together, but as it evolves, even though these three entities are trying to achieve the same goal, they are different entities. So take a note. Now that we understand that he believes that different compositions of what we would usually say is the same entity produce new entities. We modify it, change it, describe that to plants. Maybe we could really have a look at how that relates to the human mind. Why do we assume identity and simplicity? Why do we assume the identity and the simplicity of the human mind? And his argument, of course, is around perceptions. Now, of course, I put these perceptions up here to show you that perception is subjective. It's all related to a particular point of view. But nonetheless, we all have every perception is different and distinct, right? But when we reflect on these perceptions, and I might say now we'll talk about the word impressions, because impressions are memories of perceptions. When we reflect on them, we generate ideas, and ideas start creating illusions, okay? In fact, when we reflect on these perceptions, we imagine connections between the perceptions. And this kind of unity, this kind of thing that over time is creating a continuity between what we perceive, gives us the illusion of self. So let me give you an example. Say, for instance, I'm watching a movie, and as I watch the movie, obviously I'm having thousands of millions of different perceptions that change over time. And in our imagination, we're actually imagining the connections between each instance in time as an event happens. And as we do that, we get this sense of time, and then we get this sense of, well, there must be someone who's observing this and observing the continuity, right? So this unity, this union of all these perceptions gives us the illusion of self. Take a note. Right, but he says too that the real issue about this unity is that it happens in an imaginary realm, a realm of ideas. Right, now remember, ideas are reflections on sensory impressions, okay? And he says this is where associations tend to happen between impressions, and of course associations between other ideas. And the part where things go really wrong are when we start looking at causation and resemblance, okay? Now, causation and resemblance are basically the mind's attempt to tie together all our different sensory impressions, right? And make easy transitions between impressions and ideas even, right? So we watch something happen and we try and then understand the connection between them, so we have this kind of easy transition so we can quickly sort through them and figure out how the world works. In fact, you could argue that the reason why these easy transitions between ideas and impressions are needed is that they allow us to quickly go through them and be efficient, all right? But the problem is this creates, again, the illusion of the continuity of self, because when you think about it, you could think about, just think about what people would intuitively think about themselves. They think that, okay, well, an object outside of me triggers off a sensory perception. That sensory perception triggers off a impression. That impression generates an idea. that idea in turn connects with other ideas, and because this is happening over time and over space, there must be something that is the center of all where this is happening, i.e. that's the continuity of self. But again, that's an illusion. All right? Take a note. Now, first he starts talking about this idea of resemblance, right? And resemblance allows us to reflect on memory. Now, he says that memory, and I put this in word form because in this case it wasn't just enough to have some kind of non-linguistic representation of the concept. We really needed to capture the logic of what he said. So memory allows us to form associations between past perceptions and the ideas formed from them. So whenever we think about other events, things that have happened to us in the past, our memory is able to quickly recall them, make new copies of them, and then relate them to other ideas that have happened in the past, or even things that have just happened. All right? So consciousness is basically, according to him, this is what consciousness is the capacity to recall copies of past perceptions, or more importantly, past ideas or past impressions, okay? But more importantly, we'll just say, just for now, more importantly than the last, more importantly, that it's about recalling distinct and very different perceptions, both past and the ones that just happened, and inserting them into a kind of train of thought. So we have like I'm thinking right now, and in the process, we generate something which is called resemblance. So here's my train of thought. Right now I'm thinking about a train. I'm also thinking about any other trains. And because I'm just doing that, I've automatically come up with the illusion of resemblance, okay? Or the relation of resemblance, but still that's not necessarily a given thing. It's a false creation of sameness or continuity. So take a note. So again, consciousness is the capacity to recall distinct copies of past and current perceptions, insert them into your current train of thought, right? And it helps us create relationships of resemblance between, oh, yep, oh, I remember that train, or I remember this train that I just saw, yep, I remember, oh, yeah, they must be similar because I can remember the capacity, the links between them, okay? But then he goes on to talk about causation, and causation is this really big problem. And here he says, remember, in terms of inductive reasoning, right, we're looking at two random events that occur simultaneously, and we make some kind of logical connection between them. And a classic example would be, for an Australian context, the hitting of a cricket ball. When I get my cricket bat and I actually smash the cricket ball, we could easily predict that the cricket ball is going to go somewhere, right? And most of us would make the immediate connection that the cricket bat has hit the cricket ball, therefore causing the cricket ball to travel off somewhere. But he's saying this is a false attribution of cause, because, I mean, how can you go any further than that? How can you deeply prove that, right? So he basically says it's our imagination that connects the two events, the one of the cricket, of the bat, and the two of the ball travelling and hitting each other, and then generating like the parabola that follows. He's basically saying the imagination attributes or it generates a cause and effect relationship. And objects, and when we think about it, this is further proof that maybe there is an issue with the concept of identity, right? Because identity and this idea of causation allows us to falsely assume that we exist as a person, all right? So we imagine, most of us would imagine, that whenever an object happens to do something, it triggers off a perception, which in turn affects our other perceptions, and it also allows us to understand that it will affect our future perceptions. So, you know, I guess as I am hit by a ball, I know that in the future, if I see a ball, I believe that that ball will come and hit me in the face again and will affect my future perception of what that ball does, right? But again, that's erroneous, because what just happened was past incidents of when balls have hit me in the face were merged with me just imagining a ball hit me in the face, and I'm just creating a false relationship of cause and effect and resemblance, i.e. the ball, all right? So we infer identity. And the reason why we're doing this is because we're constantly chasing our thoughts. Our thoughts just happened, and that thought just happened, and that thought just happened, but they're automatically immediately in the past. So we're constantly chasing our thoughts, and then our memories are associated, and our associations are just immediately chucked in there. And that's why we create this cause and effect relationship, because we're just trying to connect everything, but we're always doing it in the past immediately after something happened, right? So again, the train of thought is basically an assumption. All right, we assume identity is the overtime awareness of this false train of thought. Okay, so because we are having one thought after another thought, and again they meet the other criteria of being different but related, but being successional, but being what was the other one? Successional, related, different, and I forget. A changing, right? Again, there's that continuity that happens. We just generate that illusion in ourselves. Those thoughts follow one another. We again have that illusion of self because they meet that 4 criteria discussed just before. Take a note. Alrighty, so then he invites us to kind of consider what's really going on, and he uses the analogy of a republic. And probably the world's best known republic, maybe other than the Republic of France, is the Republic of the United States. And he says that the citizens are to the government as our perceptions are to the relational principle of causation, right? We think the government ties everything together and ties all these different concepts and illusions together. We think the government ties all the citizens together and makes them one united republic, right? Just like people tend to think causation is something that allows us to tie together many different impressions and many different memories, okay? And from this he starts analysing memory more closely. He says memory, again, is nothing but associations, right? And what is really weird is he goes through a little bit of a convoluted piece of logic, okay? Remember that the tying together of all these disparate memories, which are ideas and impressions based on sensory experience, creates an illusion of succession and cause and effect, all right? Again, we see many things happen. We see a sequence of them happening. We then say, hey, then this must be a cause and effect relationship. We also see change. We also see distinct impressions and events, but we all tie it together and say, okay, well, from my experience, this must be cause and effect, but it's an illusion, all right? And he says that really memory and all these kind of connections is the self. But hang on, the self is an illusion. But the closest thing we can actually ascribe to memory is that it is the self. And he says the self is still an illusion of continuity generated by memory, okay? Memory makes it seem possible that continuity can exist between events. It makes resemblance seem possible. It makes cause and effect seem possible, even though it's an illusion, right? And he then goes on to say Locke was wrong because he outlined the process through which we inferred identity, which was basically looking at how the conscious creates a psychological continuity amongst memories. But really, the main issue is that memory is one of the necessary conditions for what the self could be, but there has to be other things, okay? And in turn, so, this makes sense. Just think about it for a minute. Memory, for him, would create one of the conditions for self to exist, but there has to be other things that he hasn't found yet. So therefore, because there has to be other things he hasn't found yet, there's still a major possibility that the self doesn't exist. And it can't be consciousness that ties everything together, because consciousness, according to Locke, is that kind of singular point where we create that unity, right? So according to him, there is no active agent performing the generation of psychological continuity amongst all these different memories. There are just a bunch of bundles that happen through causational links and resemblance links, kind of create the illusion of self, but they're not really there. So memory really, from his point of view, produces... so memory is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for the self. It's one of the things that, if the self did exist, has to be there, all right? But there has to be other things. But memory produces the relations of resemblance and causation, which are the sufficient and necessary for the illusion of the self. So in other words, the illusion of the self can be proved because we have what is needed to prove that it exists, and we have all that is needed to prove that the illusion of the self exists. Again, and the key thing is this fluctuating random bunch of associations all coming together to create the illusion of causation and resemblance is in turn generating the illusion of self. But really, that's because memory is just basically allowing us to remember the causal links, to remember the impressions and remember the ideas. Okay? Now, that was unbelievably complex. Unbelievably. You need to ask me questions, all right? And I will get you guys to have a look at some questions to study when you come into class. The questions that I would like you to study, actually I'll go through right now. I would like you to have a look at the right question on 149. I'd like you to have a look at the right question on 150. I would then like you to think about the think question on page 150. I'd like you then to have a look at the discuss question on page 151. I would then like you to have a look at the discuss question on page 152. And then I would like you to have a look at the do questions on page 153, but leave out the class question, which is question 3 of the do questions on page 153. Do all 3 discuss questions on page 154, and do the write and compare questions on page 155. It's probably worth noting here, and I didn't put it in there because I thought it was just really obvious to infer this. If you understand that the mind has a tendency to want to create the illusion of continuity through associations of resemblance and associations of causation, then obviously the soul is some kind of psychologically produced illusion. It's just an attempt to attribute sameness to self, but of course in an immortal way, so you don't feel horrible. And that's something that you should also explore when you get the chance. So, alright, we need to explain a simplified account of Hume's theory so that we can read his text with more depth. We need to read a simplified visual account of Locke's theory. That's what this is. We will read it in the next video, but when we read in the next video, we will go into a bit more depth and detail. Alright, we're going to name, define and interrelate these key terms. That's what we've done right here, okay, in the whole concept map. And we've outlined a sequence of that basically led to Hume's contention, which is basically that the only thing we can prove that really exists is the illusion of self. The self might exist, but we're not quite sure because we only can prove the existence of one necessary condition, but that necessary condition isn't sufficient in and of itself. And then we just basically move on from there. Then we've got the conclusion about the soul I just mentioned. All right. So quickly score yourself on these success criteria, and let's get those questions done. Cheers.